So, Bob Kane, what drew you to philosophy in the first place?
What drew me to philosophy in the first place? That's rather hard to say. I was very interested even in my school days, and I read some philosophy at age 12. I read a little book. They had those books at the time that was sort of introductions to things for students that they could look at or feel. And I read this thing at age 12, and I regarded it as very fascinating, but very strange. And I didn't even agree with it then. And I only found out later who the fellow was that wrote it. It was A.J. Ayer. And I was not turned on by any means by the negativity about philosophy and what you could do with it and what you could learn from it. And I think in a way, a funny thing, A.J. Ayer inspired me to, really think that philosophy might have something contrary to what he was having to say, but I didn't even know it was him or who he was or what he
Right.
was at the time. I was just 12. Now, that sparked my interest, I think. But I never really designed myself for necessarily going into philosophy when I went to college or anything like that. I was very interested in it, but I was interested in the intellectual life. I could have majored in any number of things, which I did. As a matter of fact, I majored in German and um, French literature. But I was at a school that required a lot of philosophy anyway. So I had to take
Good
that.
school.
Well, yeah. It was a small Catholic school in Massachusetts, a very good school, as a matter of fact, high quality. Um, and they required a lot of philosophy anyway. And it was also a little bit dull, some of that old scholastic stuff and whatever.
Right.
But at least I got it. It was good in the history of philosophy. I got the ancient Greeks and I got the medievals and early modern even. I wasn't too up on modern stuff except for continental, which I was interested in because of the English and the French literature. And then in my junior year, I went overseas and I studied at the University of Vienna.
Oh,
That was for 1 year, and that was a pretty influential thing on me because I got more into um, continental philosophy, actually. Later,
boo.
later I was to become an analyst, but that's a longer story. Okay, so I got into continental philosophy over there. In fact, one of my teachers, I had a lecture. It was a fairly large lecture, so I can't say I knew him or anything. But one of my lecturers was Viktor Frankl, who you may know as having written *Man's Search for Being*. He had been in concentration camps, and he was just out. That was 1959. And he was well known as what they called, it was existential psychiatry in those days, a kind of combination of the psychiatric profession with the existentialists. And he's very known to all those people over there. That was an influence. I had one guy that was really ferociously for Heidegger. But I had another Jewish professor who, even then, long before it became known over here, was very down on Heidegger
Right.
and explained to us about his connections with the Nazis. So I was very into that long before it became a thing over here in America among the various thinkers. Well, that was a pretty decisive thing. And then I went back to school and thought, yeah, I like this stuff, this philosophy. So I had to pick a graduate school, and the number one school at that time, which was 1960, happened to be Yale. It didn't last long because there was a big breakup in the 60s later on that knocked it out of the running. Some people retired and so on, but it was a top-rated school then.
Of course.
And it was also big for me because it was one of the few that were known in those days as a pluralist department. Well, that has always been a problem ever since in terms of our academic culture.
Right.
And it was pluralist in those days. And being pluralist, of course, they had any number of very good analytic philosophers there. And it turned out that I went there for the pluralism, which was good for me. But I was attracted to whom I thought was the best philosopher there, and that was Wilfrid Sellars. And I worked with him a lot. I took a full-year course on Wittgenstein and any number of other courses with him. But I also studied with others. Norwood Russell Hanson was a very well-known philosopher of science.
Yeah.
I really liked him a lot. A few years later, of course, we know he had a tragic death in that plane accident when he was flying up there. But he was an influence on me. And then a whole range of logicians, Noel Belknap and Alan Anderson and Fred Fitch, and many of these guys went on with Sellars to Pittsburgh very shortly, at 65, 66, and so on and so forth. Because of the stress, all pluralistic departments have a lot of internal stress, it's very hard to hold them together. And that was happening here. And they finally all packed up and left together, including one of my friends who was a graduate student at the time, Rich Thomason. He went with them. And I liked these guys, and I hung out with them a lot in Alan Anderson's suite because he was a master of one of the colleges. And they were, at that time, developing what they called relevance logic. I think you probably know about that. But it was in the development stage then. I sat in a lot of their meetings, and I was fascinated by them, and I still get along. I was taken by the fact that later on in life, when Belknap and several other people at Pittsburgh put out a very interesting book on time and indeterminism. They used Rich Thomason's branching time theory of the world and added to it an action theory. Now, I wish I could remember the name of that book, but it came out about 10 years ago. And it's a very, very good account that I can use in my own work, about how we can relate indeterminism and branching time to the notion of action and how we choose and how we act and so on and so forth, but all very, very formal stuff. Belknap since they quoted me several times in the book about how this might be related to free will, Belknap sent me a copy of the book signed, by the three guys. There was another couple of other guys, more computer science oriented types that wrote it with him. Sent me a copy of the book and said, you might enjoy this, and we, you will like the fact that we spoke kindly of your view and your notion of the intelligibility problem about free will, and thought we might have some contribution to it. But he had completely forgotten. So I had to write back to him. I said, well, thanks, that's great. I said, but do you know, I was a student of yours back at Yale. Huh. And he had completely forgotten.
Well, it's pretty amazing he's still doing top-level work.
Oh, yeah, I know, that's true. But anyway, so I worked with my dissertation. And by the way, there were a lot of, it was a diverse department. One of the persons I was attracted to most was Bran Blanchard. That he was an old-time British idealist. His guys were Bosanquet and Bradley and
wow.
All these guys and whatever. There's a Library of Living Philosophers book on Bran, and I really liked him too. So I like the pluralism, but I really attracted to Sellars and worked with him. And my dissertation was on intentionality in mind. And I didn't really segue to free will for a few years later, although I got interested in it with him. He was a compatibilist.
Yeah, maybe this would be a good segue. You could, first of all, because that time, 50s, 60s, was a time where most people were compatibilists, I would say, and there were exciting... the debate between the compatibilists and the libertarians it seemed to be the compatibilists were winning, and you got these major papers that are, I mean, particularly Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, but also Frankfurt's work. So maybe you could, for viewers of this who aren't familiar with the main problems, and because
Right.
you're famous for presenting all of the problems in books like this one,
Yes, that's right.
you could
Yeah.
sort of lay out perhaps what compatibilism is and then the major problems for it.
Yeah, that's good. And indeed, this was, by the way, a period between 60 and 64 when I was there working with sellers. And as I've often said in my writings, the landscape of the free will issue was very different in those days because, for one thing, you were coming off a strong logical positive tradition, which regarded the problem as a pseudo problem, because it was all about freedom of action, and there were no particular difficult philosophical issues about freedom of action. There were a lot of issues, and the whole question of determinism was a non-starter. Don't worry about it. It's not a problem for free will. And compatibilists, therefore, were people who thought, in the words of Dan Dennett, that we could have all the freedom worth wanting, even if determinism were true.
So, in other words, determinism being the view that the complete state of, if you could have a snapshot of the complete state of the universe at any moment, and you knew all of the laws of the universe, you could map out the entire future of the universe thenceforth, including every action that any being would take in that time.
Yes, that's right. But I usually don't put it that way. I put it in a simpler way, which I think is more historically accurate, going all the way back to the Stoics and many, many others. And that is that determinism is the view that given the past at any time and the laws governing the universe, there is only one possible future. That would mean that the alternative, indeterminism, is the view that at least at some times, given the past at some times in the history of the universe and the laws governing it, there's more than one possible future.
Okay, but of course, I mean,
So
nowadays,
the picture, the Garden of Forking Paths kind of picture, there. Yeah.
nowadays, I mean, compatibilists want to say there's still possible,
Right.
there's other possible worlds. It's just that they have slightly different laws from ours.
Yeah, well, yes, they might say that, and they also say that it doesn't. I mean, free will is compatible with determinism. I mean, if it should turn out to be indeterminism in the universe, I mean, if quantum theory, the indeterministic interpretation of quantum theory should be right, compatibilism in their view is still the right view. Because it wouldn't matter. In fact, indeterminism would cause a problem because it would make it uncertain what you were doing. It would mean you would lose control. I mean, in some ways, you could say that Hume was not a determinist because he didn't think you could bring necessity and possibility into the description of the laws. If the laws weren't necessary, well, then maybe there might be a different future. But Hume was a compatibilist because he thought that wouldn't be of any help to free will whatsoever. Because if we're going to decide something, it has to be that that decision comes out of our best reasons and whatever, and the way we are at the time. And if it doesn't, it's not really free and a responsible action. It'll be an accident or something, you see. So a lot of modern compatibilists now taking quantum theory seriously say, well, we're not denying that determinism might be false, but it doesn't really matter for the free will issue because we have free will with determinism anyway, and indeterminism wouldn't be any help, as some people like to put it, with free will anyway. So they are still compatibilist, and basically the idea is that we can have all the freedoms worth wanting, even if determinism were true.
Right.
And
So for example, I find this very compelling. I think it's in the water in Britain. I think if you're British, you have to be a compatibilist, or at least for the
right,
most part. And so that always made perfect sense to me. That so Locke and Mill and Hume and all those guys are basically compatibilists, and the position being that what I want out of freedom is I want control. I want it to be the case. I consider my action free if it's what I wanted or what I desired or and combined with my beliefs. So if I'm in control of my action, that's what's important about freedom. So not being free is when somebody else is forcing me to do something, either by holding a gun to me or by brainwashing me or whatever. But it must be the case that to be free, I have to be in control, which requires determinism. Because if things happen at random, then I could want to move my arm and then suddenly my arm flies off in another direction. And that's not freedom. That's in fact absence of freedom. So
yes.
I was found very compelling the randomness complaint against libertarianism. But
So,
you have a response to that, or at
well,
least you have a way of dealing with that.
it's an extremely powerful complaint, and it comes under many forms, luck, chance, accident, all that kind of stuff. And I do have a response to it. But before I get to there, let's stick with the 1960 situation,
Okay.
where I say that in those days, and it's still the case today, compatibilism was the default position for everybody, every philosopher who took science seriously,
Right.
didn't want to appeal to mystery. And libertarians at that time, all of them, had some kind of mysterious or obscure account of things. I mean, going way back to Kant with a noumenal world, because somehow we can't make sense of it in a deterministic universe. A Cartesian with immaterial soul, or down to modern times in the 50s and 60s, it was some sort of agent causation theory where there was a special kind of agent cause that couldn't in principle be caused itself by prior events.
As Chisholm had a view like that, didn't he?
Absolutely. Rod Chisholm was a big guy there. And Sellers' arguments with Chisholm about the nature of mind and how it worked was part of my dissertation. So, I mean, and I had a great admiration for Chisholm as a philosopher too, but he held this view, this agent causation view, as did others. And then there were even views that, so-called non-causalist views that, its volitions just can't be caused and things like that. And in his famous essay, which you mentioned in 1962, Freedom and Resentment, Strawson spoke here very nicely and influentially about the fact of what he called all of these views were the quote-unquote panicky metaphysics of libertarianism, right? And that was the usual assumption. If you had a scientifically oriented person, whatever, you had to be a compatibilist. And otherwise, you had to engage in some kind of crazy, panicky metaphysics. You have to postulate extra entities and so on. And I liked neither of those options. And as a matter of fact, that was my initial getting into this with Sellers, even though I didn't do it in my dissertation.
Wise move. Don't do it don't get into it with your advisor when you're writing your dissertation.
Because for one thing, he admired Strawson's essay, Freedom and Resentment. He admired Strawson generally because Sellers had made this distinction between the manifest image of humans in the world and the scientific image, which is had been an influential distinction ever since. And the manifest image is what we now think of as folk psychology, folk intuitions, the way we normally think about it, and scientific image as well, what we understand science to be, whatever that is. His view was that we have mixed intuitions in the manifest image. Many of them are compatibilist. And there are some that are in libertarian, incompatibilist, libertarian, and so on. But when you move over to the scientific image, you can't make any sense of libertarian intuitions, even though they might be over here. So you got to drop them And being a scientific realist, that was the issue for him. And it's interesting that he took Strawson's book Individuals as a prime example of the manifest image in general. And so freedom and resentment was just part of that whole picture. Well, I went into his office one day, and I was very interested in the problem. I was thinking of writing a paper on it for the course. And I said to him, well, I'm not sure, I said. I think we can make sense of free will in the scientific image. And that still is that has been my project for 40 years, because that's really what I'm doing. I completely eschew, and I reject, and I don't think adequate any of the panicky metaphysics of traditional. So I just throw those things out the window. What can we do without them? That was my question.
So
I went into Sellers' office one day, talked to him about a paper I was doing, and I said that I was going to try to show that you could actually make sense of a libertarian free will within a scientific context, without appealing to mystery and so on. And I said, and he was very doubtful. He gave me a tough time in there. And I said to him, okay, I'll be back in 3 weeks with an answer. And he laughed and went back to
40 years later, you're nearly there.
Right, he went back to reading his Sports Illustrated. Then, like the usual brash and naive graduate student at the door, I turned around and said, or at least by the end of the semester. So anyway, that was kind of how it all started. And as I often joke, as you just put it nicely, 45 years later, I'm still at it. So it wasn't so easy, but it was certainly invigorating. So anyway, so go ahead then with your.
Right. Why can't you be happy with compatibilism? So as you said, Dennett likes to say, it gives us all the freedom worth wanting. Apparently, you want more. What is the more you want?
Absolutely. And I can put it a number of ways. You can come at it either from the point of view of freedom or from the point of view of responsibility. Let me start with the responsibility side, just for the moment, because it's I think a good side. I believe there are two dimensions of responsibility. The first dimension is the obvious one that compatibilists and everybody can capture and understand, and that is responsibility for expressing in action the will you have, where we understand the will here in a broad sense to mean your character traits, your motives, your emotions, your feelings, any of those complex sets of dispositions that incline you to act in one way or another. That's what the will one of the meanings of will historically. So the first dimension of responsibility is responsibility for expressing in action the will you have without constraint, without anybody preventing you, without coercion, whatever. So it really comes from your own self. That is the view, that is the kind of responsibility that compatibilists, that dimension, is what they get and what they want. And it's very important, and I don't deny it for a minute. But I believe there's a second dimension of responsibility that we are concerned with in life, in many practical contexts, but even beyond that, in the courtroom, for example, or whatever. And that's a second dimension of responsibility, which I call responsibility for having the will that you express in action. So we have responsibility for expressing the will you have in action, and responsibility for having the will you express in action.
Right. So the example that Dennett uses, and I don't know if he was the first to use this, but is the one of Martin Luther, who famously said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Now, what Dennett wants to contend is that the fact that let's take him literally. Right. Probably it's not true, but let's take him literally, that he cannot do otherwise than what he did. because of the nature of his character and his will. So in that case, his character and his will completely determine his action.
Absolutely.
Nonetheless, we regard him as free. So Dennett says, voila, that's good enough. Whereas you want to say is, no, what we require is that the character that determines his action, he has to have had some kind of role in shaping that character. Because if it was just handed to him, or if it was created by others, then he wouldn't be free.
No, that's well put, and that's the way I answered Dennett in any number of writings on this score. I point out that I do not deny that he could have been responsible and completely responsible, even if he was determined by his existing will at that time. But that would be, on my view, to the degree that in the process of his past life, he had brought himself to a state where he had that will that he had then. And indeed, I think if we look at Luther's biography, we see the many struggles he went through and the conflicts he had to undergo, where I believe he could have gone down different paths, but he didn't. And he brought himself to this point. I mean, if anybody struggled, because I see that getting that deeper sense of having the will, or creating your own will, or forming your own will, is what I mean by free will. And it occurs in occasions which I call self-forming actions. And these are actions which arise when there are various conflicts in our lives where we have good reasons for going either way, and we have to decide between them. So in those situations of conflict, I argue, I'll say more about this later, but I argue that what happens is that the conflict and the difficulty in the choice stirs up a certain amount of indeterminism from the synaptic levels in the brain, and actually that indeterminism is amplified by the nonlinear processing in the brain, which is very well accepted. It's not exactly chaos all the time, but that's the idea. And we know that the brain gets worked up in situations of conflict. So we get that stirring up of conflict in the brain. And so the uncertainty we feel phenomenologically is reflected in an actual indeterminism in our neural processes. That's the way.
I can quote you. There is a tension and uncertainty in our minds at such times of inner conflict, which are reflected in appropriate regions of our brains by movement away from thermodynamic equilibrium. There's your scientific realism. In short, a kind of stirring up of chaos in the brain that makes it sensitive to micro-indeterminacies at a neuronal level. As a result, the uncertainty and inner tension we feel at such soul-searching moments of self-formation is reflected in the indeterminacy of our neural processes themselves. What is experienced phenomenologically as uncertainty corresponds physically to the opening of a window of opportunity that temporarily screens off complete determination by the past. And that last part, presumably, is your response to the consequence argument, as it is now referred to.
That's right. So, yes, that's very good. I don't know whether you were reading that or you.
Yeah, I was reading it. It's a quote from you.
And so on. But I say I'm going to hire this guy. But in any case, yeah, that's the idea. The only thing I would change there now is I would leave out the chaos, because it doesn't necessarily require chaos, which is a tricky, complicated business. But rather, all you need is nonlinearity in the processing of the brain, because it will amplify minor things and so on. That's been made by a number of recent philosophers of science. That point has been made. And it's very well known. There's some debate about the extent to which chaos plays a role in the brain, although it's often thought so. But there's widespread acknowledgement that the brain is nonlinear in its functioning, and that's good enough to amplify minute quantum indeterminacies if the occasion arises. Even in one of the more really hard-nosed neuroscientists around, Christoph Koch, who's very well known and so on, and he denies all the kind of extravagant views about how indeterminism might be in the brain and be the source of consciousness, and Penrose and some of these other people. He's skeptical of all those views, but he says the one thing that you cannot rule out is that minute quantum indeterminacies at the synaptic level or in the neurons and so on might at times be amplified in the neuroprocessing in the brain. And that's where we might get the randomness that is well known to occur there.
Okay, so
he says that's a part. And for my view, on other views, you need some wilder things, like quantum collapses that involve the whole brain. On my view, that's all you need.
So when you say self-forming actions, there seems to be two senses of this. And the first sense is that the self or the will, the thing that, the thing, for example, that determines Martin Luther to nail the theses to the door. So you're talking, the self must be formed for it to be free. So that's the one sense, that the self is the thing being formed. But then at the same time, you also want to say, it must be me that's doing it. So the self is both formed and former. It's for me and former, which sounds like bootstrapping, which sounds impossible.
Well, no, it isn't, because you see, the self could have been formed by the past, by the upbringing, by the genes, the environment, in the normal way that people think about that. But it's formed in such a way, I would say, that at certain points in life, the will and the structure of the brain and the structure of the self is such that we enter into complex situations in which more than one option is consistent with the way our self has been so far been formed. And even if our self so far been formed is completely determined, we can encounter situations in which that determined self is actually now torn between different things, and we come to a crossroads because each of these things are consistent with our existing will, with everything we are. My example I often use, and it's often quoted and discussed, is I have a businesswoman going to a meeting, and you're undoubtedly familiar with that. And she's very ambitious, and she's got to get to this meeting, and she's afraid her boss will be angry with her if she doesn't make it on time. She sees an assault in an alley. Well, she also thinks of herself as a moral person. Nobody else is around. If she doesn't alert the police and stop and get some help or something, this bad act will take place. But then she'll be late to the meeting, and she imagines the boss, and she might even lose her job. This is such a crucial meeting. And so she is torn in that way. Now, those are the kind of situations, I think, where she could go either way, and her will is torn either way, and she makes a choice, and that choice is a forming choice for her, because as Aristotle says, you make enough of these over time. You make enough immoral acts over time, you become an immoral person. You make enough, and Aristotle says in answer to objections about that only a fool would fail to realize that if you go on doing selfish things, you're going to become a selfish person, whole hog, and the other way around. And this is what happens. Now, it does follow that my notion of developing or forming the will is a matter of degree. And I believe a number of things about free will as I understand. It's very limited because we are very much influenced by heredity and environment and so on. And that's where the science part comes in. You see, the traditional notion of appealing to extra, panicky metaphysics, so to speak, was to get us outside of the scientific nexus and somehow be able to act quite independently of those influences on us. And I think one aspect of trying to make sense of this within science is to realize that free will is a very limited thing. It's not an all or nothing affair. At any given time, we're always hemmed in by these possibilities. Now, there's a big debate that people bug me about. There are many. There are so many. I can hardly even list them. But one is, well, what about the first SFAs of childhood? What happens there? And I have a view about that. It's a very, very good point. When do they start and how do they start? Because clearly when they start, you do have that idea that you put forward, that we are totally determined at that point. Well, how do they start? Well, I suspect they start somewhere between 2 and 3. Having raised children, you probably have yourself. I suspect they start at age somewhere between 2 and 3, when the child begins to question whether they should do what mommy says or take the cookies or this or that. So
What mommy or what tummy?
yeah, mommy or tummy. Good, I like that. And you see that beginning to happen there. And I think that's where the first SFAs begin. I once gave a talk of this at some university or other. And when I said this, this happens a lot. When I said this, the chairman of the department says, "Oh no, wait a minute," he said. I've got a little one there who's less than 2 years old, and he's already doing it." He says he used to sit up on his high chair and swish all that food right off, no problem. But now he looks at me before he does it, and I know he's thinking, should I upset Daddy, or should I do what I want to do? And I said, okay, well, I guess, well, you got a very bright boy there. So he insists. And it's funny, I often get that from parents who said, well, my child does it earlier than that.
Little do they know, though, that
Right.
they should allow their child the bliss of irresponsibility for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I know.
They're
There are two.
advocating for child prisons.
Well, there are two sides to that. But here's the other point about this. It's very interesting to speculate about this, because my view is that in those first SFAs, the responsibility is very minimal, almost infinitesimal, and therefore it's crazy. Like this woman who took her child down to the police department and threatened jail with him to straighten him out, and he
Oh,
was
that
all.
happened to Hitchcock. Apparently, that's why he was terrified of the police because his dad did that to him when he was a kid.
There you go. Now that is truly absurd. That is truly absurd. But it's not off the map to have minor punishments like no go to your room, or no dessert tonight, or little things and so on, because in my view, it's equally a mistake for parents not to hold the children responsible at all at a very early age, because if you do that, they will not develop a will of their own formation and any kind of discipline about these matters. So there's two mistakes here. One is to think, we're not responsible at all for these things, and not to be held so by parents. And the other, that we're kind of somehow totally responsible, which is absurd. So I believe that responsibility is very limited at that age, and it is limited all along throughout our life, but it develops over time as we make more and more SFAs. If a child is still doing these things at age 8, 9, 10, 12, then you might have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, here's something that has occurred to me in thinking about this. Um, it seems one of the things that is a matter of kind of brute luck, let's say, or genetics or whatever, is how shapeable yourself is. So, for example, it might be the case that some people are very, very hard to. So, for example, if they choose probity in one instance, this won't necessarily take. In other words, it's as if they're made of very hard rock and somebody's trying to shape their character and it just sort of bounces off. So now, on your view, it looks like they will then be exposed to more self-forming actions. There will be a series of self-forming actions because it won't be the case that they'll be diverted into one kind of character trait. They'll
Oh,
still have both options just as much.
oh, okay. All right. Now, yes, there are going to be people like this. And at the extreme on this spectrum, of course, is you have psychopathy, you have psychopaths. And just as I say, it's a matter of degree. That degree can go to zero in some cases. You know, Gary Watson has this wonderful article, Responsibility and the Limits of Evil, on this serial killer, Robert Harris, on death row in California, whose father rejected him because he thought the mother was pregnant from another guy. And the mother didn't want to lose the father, so she rejected him from an early age. He tried to come up to her. She would push him away. And we have to have enough human sense, I think, to realize that his ability to develop a character of his own other than the vicious person he came is very limited, probably minimal. And this is what should happen in the so-called punishment phases of criminal trials. We focus on the first dimension of responsibility. Did he do it? Did it come from his will? Was he coerced or whatever? In the guilt phase, although I wouldn't like to use that word alone, because I think guilt applies to both. But then in the punishment phase, we begin to look into the history of the person, and we may mitigate the punishment. This is interesting because if I'm right about it being a matter of degree, then talking about mitigating punishment, and even in some cases reducing it to zero, is relevant and apt and appropriate. And so I stress that very much. As a matter of fact, I have a little saying that in an ideal world, we wouldn't make judgments about moral responsibility at all. We would leave them all to God. It would have to, or some omniscient being, you see. And that is my own expression of the limitations we would feel here. And so my view is that I tell a story like Watson's, and in his recent book, Sean Nichols has written a nice book on this, and he discusses my example and Watson's on this about a trial. And my own example comes from personal stuff in our neighborhood. A young man had assaulted and raped a young girl, and we knew the young girl's family. Okay? And we went to the trial and whatever and so on. And, you know, clearly he was guilty and he was a vicious young man. And you listen to the whole story and it's clear that he did it. He did it of his own will. It was an ill will. It was a vicious will, but he did it of his own will. And all the evidence pointed in that direction. And then when they started going through the punishment phase and looking at this thing, most of us there began to feel that the punishment ought to at least be mitigated because of the horrible circumstances that we would describe, something like Watson's Robert Harris story. And that happened to most of us. And then some people say, well, that happened to you because you're a philosopher, you know, and you... No way. All our neighbors were there, my wife and myself, and they were, you know, over here we have a football coach, and across the street a businesswoman, and a computer guy here. The guy next door is a inventor of Yeti coolers, and you know, they're ordinary folk, but they all were like us, saying, oh, I don't know, this kid had a really rough time,
Yeah,
and we should mitigate. And then my thought is, if there are any people in that courtroom who are not moved at all by this story of the kid's upbringing and his past, but said, no, he did it, he's a vicious bastard, we're gonna put him away, then what I say is, I wouldn't want those people anywhere near a jury deciding the fate of anybody I loved or cared about, or anybody whatever. That's the line I use at that point. So that's why I feel strongly about this other dimension of freedom, how we got to be responsibility for having the particular will that we do have. And in answer to Dennett on this Loslick example, which I have discussed on a number of occasions, is I agree with Dennett that, yes, Luther could have been fully and totally responsible for this act, even if he was totally determined at the moment of doing it. It might be the most responsible act of his whole life. But I would still say that he would be so to the degree that through many self-forming actions in his past, he had made himself into the kind of person he was then. So that's the line.
I'm going to quote you again. If there were no such undetermined self-forming actions in our lifetimes, there would have been nothing we could have ever voluntarily done to make ourselves different than we are. A condition that I think, is inconsistent with our having the kind of responsibility for being what we are, which genuine free will requires.
That's right.
So I'm going to push you a little bit on this.
Can I interpose?
Sure. Sorry.
One further distinction here. Don't forget your point.
I won't.
But when I give you these two dimensions of responsibility, the first one is the one that compatibilists capture, and it's related to what I call to freedom of action. This is the freedom to express your will in action. It's the second dimension that I say is related to freedom of will. So I distinguish freedom of action, freedom of will. And there are many freedoms, and indeed there are a whole spectrum of freedoms of action.
5 freedoms, you say, in the last chapter of this one.
In the last chapter, I have 5, and that's right. I read that the other day, anticipating this thing, and I said, "Gee, this is pretty damn good." But that they are worth discussing, by the way, because they all have a role in the history of the debates of the problem. But in any case, I distinguish freedom of action and freedom of will. And freedom of will is connected with the second dimension, responsibility. And freedom of action is with the first. And the way I see the development of modern thought, with Locke and Hobbes and Hume and other people like this, is to say, oh, no, the will, that was some notion of the medievals, outdated now, not fit for modern science. We got to focus on freedom of action and the freedom of the agent. That's what Locke said. And in a way, he's right if he means the problem isn't about the freedom of the will, the problem's about the freedom of agency, said Locke. And he's absolutely right, except my answer is the freedom of agency has 2 dimensions, namely the freedom of action and the freedom of will. And it's that second dimension of free agency that has caused all the problems down through history. No one would have a problem about freedom of action. Compatibilists cover that one. Now, when it comes to freedom of will, compatibilists say, well, we can't have that anyway because of this ultimacy business and the regresses and the luck and the chance and all the rest of it. Okay, I buy it. I realize there are very serious problems here, and you have to make sense of this freedom of will. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but it is different than freedom of action.
Yeah, I have a sort of 2-pronged point. The first point is, why can't it be the case that a compatibilist could say, I absolutely agree with you that you've got to have freedom of action and you've got to have this freedom of self-formation, but I can give a compatibilist account of self-formation. Right. For example, that seems to be Mill's view. Mill does seem to have the view that you can change the way you are by working at it.
Right. Well, yes, and that is a very, very common thing. But the question is, at every juncture, when you are supposedly changing the way you are, the question is, could you have done otherwise than change your way in the way you did? And if determinism was true, the answer has got to be no.
Okay, so that brings in the requirement for indeterminacy.
Granted, we are constantly changing ourselves, so we have that feeling of doing it. But if indeed the change we make in ourselves at any given time is in fact determined by our past, then we don't have it. We don't have freedom of will in the sense in which I understand it. But you're absolutely right. Some compatibilists try to capture this notion. Some don't, by the way. Harry Frankfurt doesn't worry about it. This is often said to be a historical dimension to freedom, and some compatibilists say, no, we got to have that. John Fisher, for example, thinks we must have it, and Mike McKenna thinks we might have it, and so on. But there are some, like Frankfurt, that are very adamant. No, in fact, I'll tell you a story about Frankfurt. In the 1980s, I wrote him a letter. Okay, I'm still a reasonably young philosopher, of course, and great admiration for him, and he's influential. And I said to him, I said, the usual objection to your view is that we have free will when we are wholeheartedly committed to what we're doing, so that our whole self is behind what we do. That, by the way, is what I call freedom of self-perfection in the final chapter there.
Okay.
So we're wholeheartedly committed to doing what we want to do, and there's no ambivalence. That's when we truly have free will. And the usual argument against him by Watson and any number of others is a standard kind of regress type of thing, saying, but wait a minute, are we responsible for becoming wholehearted or what? And that's a good objection, I think. That's an important objection. But I had another one that no one had ever made. And it's been repeated a few times, but I sent it to him in this letter. I said, I gave the regular objection. I said, this is what another thing bothers me, however. If free will is what you mean, then we never can get from ambivalence to wholeheartedness of our own free will, because we wouldn't have free will till we got there.
Right.
Okay? And he said, because you see, I think ambivalence is crucial to free will. The conflict, and ambivalence means ambivalence. There must be points in life when we really are ambivalent and we could go either way, given our whole past. And ambivalence really means, which Frankfurt throws out the window, he hates, is the key, in my mind, to free will. Not necessarily free action, but free will. He took a few weeks to respond, because this was letter writing in those days.
Right.
Before email, I often tell student audiences that this was a time you don't remember. It was just after the last ice age.
Right.
But anyway, he responded in a very straightforward way. It was amazing. He said, well, he says, many people think I'm crazy, but I don't think it matters one whit how we got to be the way we are. What matters is whether we're wholehearted. It could have come about by a combination of luck and past circumstances and our upbringing and so on. What really matters is not how we got there, but what we are, because wholeheartedness is a great thing, and it's a great thing to attain. And that was his answer. It was pretty straightforward, it was pretty honest, and whatever. But clearly it was a total rejection of the historical dimension. So not all of them do this, and Frankfurt was pretty straightforward about this. But some realize that there's a bit of an issue here. And so they want to make sense of it. And Fisher's one, McKenna's another. Watson struggled with it too, I think. All these people are compatibilists, mind you, so they had to deal with it in some way. But so you can go back to your question.
Yeah. So
they want to try to make sense of our making, because we obviously do. Go ahead. Anyway,
it seems like with your self-forming actions, you're doing two things at once. Because if I want to say that compatibilists think they can give self-forming actions, and you say they're not good enough. And the reason you say they're not good enough is because there has to be this could have done otherwise element, which is where indeterminism comes in, which is where you point to quantum mechanics as a scientific basis for indeterminism. So it seems like you're doing two things. You're providing for formation of the will, while at the same time responding to the consequence objection. This view that if determinism is true, then nothing is up to us.
Yes. Yes,
So you're sort of baking the indeterminism in to the self-formation, and that's what your plural voluntary control
yeah,
notion.
I call that plural voluntary control because, on my view, and this is not true of all incompatibilists, it isn't just indeterminism is nowhere near enough to get us free will. You need really two conditions. You need the fact that the choices are undetermined, could go either way, but that you have a kind of control over them such that either way they go, you have the power to voluntarily, intentionally, and rationally go that way, or voluntarily, intentionally, and rationally go that way.
Because
And the reason
that way, what you're
I
doing there is you're blocking off the kind of randomness objection that the
right,
compatibilists say. You know,
right,
if
but the
things
reason,
just happen to me, then I
but
wouldn't
the
be free. Whereas you're saying either way I go, it will be something that I would fully endorse.
right now that's the idea to block off the randomness objection, but it doesn't just saying that doesn't block it off because it's a hell of a job trying to explain how you can have plural voluntary control over these outcomes, given that they are undetermined.
Mm-hmm.
That's where all the work begins. But this requirement is there. And one reason for making it is that you can imagine situations. I mean, John Austin imagined this years ago, as did Elizabeth Anscombe and so on, in which indeterminism does in fact function in our choices, but it isn't anything like free will. For example, I use this example. If you go up to a coffee machine intending to press the button for coffee with black coffee, and because of some indeterminism in your neural processes, either in the brain or in the arm, you press the wrong button, that's undetermined, right? But supposing that it was undetermined, you could have pressed the wrong button and you pressed the right button, then you did it and you were free and it was voluntary, intentional, and rational. And you could have done otherwise, but that's not anything like what we mean by free will. So it's not what I caution libertarians and incompatibilists about just talking about could have done otherwise. That's not good enough. It's could have done otherwise voluntarily, rational, and intentionally. It could have gone more than one way. This is what I mean by plural voluntary control. And you need that because just being able to do otherwise. Now, when I said that coffee machine example, you know that J.L. Austin had the classic example. He talked about a 3-foot putt,
Mm-hmm.
which he might miss. And he says, it was undetermined, but I hit it. And that still means I did it, even though it was undetermined. And I'm responsible for doing it. Now I play on that idea too, by the way. But the point is that indeterminism just isn't enough to deal with the could have done otherwise issue. So that's worth making too. So you're right. I have this plural voluntary control and indeterminism. Need those two things together for SFAs.
Now,
by the way, you don't need them for other free will choices like Luther's later on, right?
right, but if it were the case, it is your view that if it were the case that if Luther had no SFAs in his history, then
Right.
his here I stand, I could know another actually wouldn't be free. That is, you have
No,
to be.
it would be an act of freedom, free action. It would be definitely a free if all the other compatibilist conditions were satisfied. He wasn't coerced at the time.
Right.
He wasn't compulsively acting. He was doing it intentionally. He knew exactly what he was doing. All those compatibilist conditions are absolutely important. In fact, they're important for my own SFAs. You have to satisfy those conditions as well in my SFAs, but they're not enough because you got to have the plural voluntary control too. But those conditions are absolutely crucial. And they also are a very necessary element in responsibility because we just happen to, Dennett happens to assume all that with Luther in this case, as do most of us, because it did seem to be that none of these other conditions held. So there have to be these conditions, and these are the conditions for freedom of action and responsibility in the first dimension. And I don't underplay this. It's an interesting thing about incompatibilist views of free will. They presuppose compatibilist views as an essential part of them. The opposite, of course, does not hold. So I don't underestimate all of the compatibilist thoughts here about what it amounts to, and it's necessary. But to me, it's not sufficient for what I call ultimate responsibility.
Yeah, I think
If you don't have the
could I
self-formation.
perhaps you know this, but someone who's taken taken your view, or at least a view very like yours, and applied it in a kind of interesting way in a philosophy of religion question. I mentioned this before. Is a guy called James Sennett, and he wrote this paper. Briefly, it's about whether or not we're free in heaven, because of course this is a puzzle with regard to the problem of evil. If the usual response to the problem of evil is the free will defense, right, or the free will theodicy, where they say, yes, God is all powerful and all loving, but the reason why there's evil is because he gave us this undetermined free will. So it has to be libertarian free will, because if it's consequentialist free will, then he could have set up the laws of the universe so that we were caused to always act in a good way. So it has to be libertarian free will. And that's why we do evil on earth. But then the obvious question is, but wait a minute, what about in heaven? In heaven, are there going to be people murdering in heaven? Are there going to be people doing evil things? And they want to say, no, in heaven, you always do good. Well, but then wait a minute, if heaven is supposed to be the best possible place, does that mean we're not free in the best possible place? Well, that undercuts your whole free will defense, because what's the value of giving us freedom if we don't have it in heaven? It's obviously not such a great thing. So the puzzle is, you have to both say, we are free in heaven, because otherwise freedom isn't the great value, it doesn't have the great value it needs to be for the free will defense. But you've also got to say, somehow we don't do evil. But you've also got to say, and yet we do evil on earth because of freedom. And his ingenious suggestion is that the freedom we have on earth is the kind of freedom of self-formation. But when we get to heaven, we have fully formed selves, and we no longer need to form them anymore because they're perfect. So we will just be like Luther, and we can do no otherwise than the good that we do. So you can see it's kind of an ingenious use of.
Well, it is, and it's exactly what I would try to say here if I said anything. Now, I try to be a little cautious on the religious dimensions of all of this for obvious reasons, because it's like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. But that's the direction I would go, and I would refer you here, once again, that you showed that last chapter I have of my contemporary introduction of free will. I distinguish 5 freedoms there. The first 3 are compatibilist freedoms, and the last 2 are libertarian freedoms.
Right.
The first is self-realization, and that is the ability to realize the self you have, or the will you have in action. That's the one we understand. That's the usual compatibilist. The second one is a freedom of reflective self-control, which a number of compatibilists have put forward, including Frankfurt and others. And that's a legitimate kind of freedom, too. But the third compatibilist freedom is the interesting one. It's the freedom of self-perfection. And this is the freedom of as I put it, of the saints in heaven, if you wanted an image of it, who cannot do wrong because their will is formed in such a way that they are unable to do evil. And by the way, it would seem that must be the freedom God has, too, in a religious context. Right. So you need that freedom of self-perfection idea. It's interesting, if you look at the history of free will debate, you find a tremendous amount of confusion about this, because many people who've talked about, even Augustine, at a certain point he comes to a point of saying, well, yeah, we could have perfect freedom, and it turns out to be the freedom of self-perfection. And a lot of these people don't, discussing these religious things historically, do not distinguish the freedom of self-perfection from the other two freedoms that I put in my list of 5, and they are the freedom of self-determination, which Luther has when he does act from a will that he had formed earlier, the freedom of self-determination, and the last one I call the freedom of self-formation, which is what we do when we engage in self-forming actions. Okay, now this is interesting, however. It just occurred to me, as a matter of fact. We ought to have these conversations more often.
Hey, if this didn't record, we'll have to do it again.
Right. Okay. But anyway.
Called your bluff.
Yeah, well, it just occurred to me that the saints in heaven, like Sennett says, this sounds to me very astute, they would have the freedom of self-perfection. And that is a legitimate freedom. But they would also have what I call the libertarian freedom of self-determination, because that's what Luther had when he was determined to do the right thing here, that he thought was the right thing, because he had formed himself in such a way that he would do that.
But
and
that would be something that would be something that God wouldn't have, though.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that depends on the view you have about God. And that's another complicated business. If your view is of God being eternal and unchanging,
right,
and whatever, then you're absolutely right. And that will be a problem. When I think about religious issues, and I sometimes do a little philosophy of religion, I'm inclined to think that the idea of God as an eternal and totally unchanging being is incoherent.
So you have open theist
I am definitely
dabblings.
Definitely an open theist, but I even incline to the idea that God develops and changes.
That could get you burnt at the stake in some period.
Well, I was influenced in talking with Charles Hartshorne, who was a colleague here for 30 years, and he's of course big on this. And Charles liked to say that God can change, but God is perfect in the sense that God is unsurpassable by anything else but himself. And so he can get better and better. But he develops and changes. But the new idea that you're suggesting to me is that the original thought would be, well, the only freedom people could have in heaven would be freedom of self-perfection, which is, by the way, a compatibilist freedom. But they could also have if the conception of heaven is what I think it ought to be, if there is such a thing, is one in which people earn it, and therefore they would also have in heaven what I call the freedom of self-determination, because that's the freedom you have if you always act from a good will, but you have been the one who created that goodwill.
Yes, and that is essentially Sennett's.
That's a new thought I had about that.
Yeah, so he wants to say that's why you have to have the earth. You have to have the earth as this. Now, of course, there's all kinds of problems with this.
Have the freedom, yeah.
There's all kinds of problems with this. I mean, the first we've already said, it might be that God doesn't have this, so can it really be that great if God doesn't have it?
And, exactly.
And the second one is, well, what about babies that die before, whenever their first self-forming action is, whether it be 2 or earlier, what about if they die before that? Are they little angel automatons and incapable of this kind of self-formation?
As I said, that's why I like to stay away from philosophy of religion to the degree that I can. I have thoughts about it. I have my own beliefs, but I think we know as much about these things as the cavemen knew about the stars anyway, so one has to be very cautious. But it does seem to me that Sennate's on the right track here if you really did get into the question of heaven, except that it suddenly occurred. It always occurred to me that the freedom God would have would be a freedom of self-perfection. And so the saints in heaven, if there were such. But it never occurred to me that they would also have the freedom of self-determination, as I define it in there. Just as Luther would have, he got to a point where he always did good, because that would be, they would have formed themselves. And as you nicely put it, that would be a reason for having them on Earth, having them in the universe, developing themselves. That's very, very interesting. I hadn't completely thought that through before, but I think it is quite an interesting thought. Maybe you should write a paper on it.
Already done. Actually, I just finished editing a book called Philosophy of Heaven, so you can check that out.
Why you're into this? There is a big debate about this, about whether we don't have libertarian free will in heaven, and people have been taking different sides. I know Kevin Timpey and a few other people
and
have been.
Paul and Timpey had a paper on that, where PAWL, yes, and they want to build on Sennate's view, but give the saints in heaven the ability to choose between singing to praise God and playing the trumpet to praise God. So it's a little bit like a limited menu.
Yeah, I see. It seems to me all these people on the right track here, but it's a problem beyond my scope to resolve. But I think it's a very, very interesting. And you're doing a.
Yeah, it's called Heaven and Philosophy. We've finished the manuscript. It just has to be typeset now.
Right. Well, there's another side of this, and that is because I oppose the idea that free will is an all or nothing thing, for reasons we've given, with a scientific orientation and the extent to which I have a very strong feeling about how much we are determined by our heredity and environment, and so on. Because I hold that, I reject things like my colleague, who's now my colleague, but I've been in contact and in interaction with his thought for many, many years, Galen Strawson, Peter Strawson's son. Galen is now my colleague. In fact, his office down the hall. In fact, for a while he had my old office. That was a very strange experience. But Galen had always talked about libertarian freedom as a quote-unquote heaven and hell freedom. But on my view, you can leave the hell out of it. I'll go with purgatory or something like that, where you wear it off, by acting good and doing good. But hell, no way, because that's infinite, given the great limitations I've talked about in terms of our actual free will and the deeper sense of responsibility. You can see why the idea of hell as an infinite suffering for finite wrongs is way, way off base. So I would reject that.
You're a universalist.
Well, no. Well, universalism doesn't necessarily follow if you have a purgatorial conception.
True, but the point of purgatory is that eventually you leave it.
Well, no, but it might be that if the evil is so great and the redemption ineffective, you just cease to exist.
Yeah, there is that option.
That's a possibility. I don't know what the answer is to these things, but it's something worth speculating about.
Okay, I want to do two things because we've already talked for a long time, but I do want to.
By the way, when I said that, I was thinking of Hitler or his.
Right. Hitler is always the one that. Yeah, as I saw the comedian Bill Burr mused about this, and he says, it's unfair on all these people who killed more than Hitler. Why don't those kills count? Everybody just talks about Hitler.
Right.
But I want to do two things. One is I want to ask one more thing about plural voluntary control. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit about your more recent book, which
Oh
is
yeah.
this one. Because there's an awful lot to say about this. It just so happens that I'm much more familiar with your free will stuff, which
Right.
is
Well,
why I focus on
I'm
that.
glad. I'm glad you showed that book. It came out in 2010, and I'm very proud of that book. I think the thoughts in it are equally important to my free will thing,
And
and
it struck
I'd
me
like to
that
see more discussion of it.
that this is sort of a throwback to your origins because you always had these pluralistic concerns, and
Very good
this is a
thought.
grand theory in the kind of Spinoza tradition,
Absolutely.
which people don't
It
do anymore.
the connection with my free will book is the idea of pluralism of values. That there can be ambivalence, so to speak, in human life, and there's a plurality of values that will work. And the whole question of pluralism of values is so central to a lot of modern discussions of ethics. Does it mean relativism, or what can we do with it? And that's one of the themes of my book. That's the connection between the only connection between my free will discussion and other, because I make the pluralism of values crucial to my theory of free will too. But I appreciate your comments about that book because I really like it, and I'm writing more about it. I just wrote a paper on relating the ideas in that book to political philosophy as
Well,
well. So it's really an interesting topic. Go ahead.
yeah.
Anyway.
So that just the one more thing about plural voluntary control. So and I brought this up in our previous talk, which is lost to posterity because of computer problems. But so you're a businesswoman. Imagine you're a businesswoman. The example of your self-forming action is the choice between helping or going on to the meeting. Now,
Right.
one of the reasons why I brought up the James Sennett thing is because this is supposed to be a very much moral character forming. So the religious people who draw on your idea want to say that the self-forming actions can't just be between cauliflower and broccoli, for dinner. It has to be between a good action and a bad action. There has to be real,
Uh,
genuine moral choice. So let's say there is that. But what you
uh,
say
by the
is
way, by the way, that isn't quite true, but just assume it it
okay.
isn't true.
Um,
Let's assume it for the sake.
right. So now the way you present it is she should endorse whichever results because there's genuine ambivalence in her self, as it were, in her will. And
And both of the different conflicting emotions are very important to her.
right, but certainly, but which one is actualized, to use language from possible world talk? To Alvin Plantinga likes to use that terminology. The one which is actualized in the real world as we know it, in our world, is uh, undetermined because of these quantum indeterminacies. So suppose it turns out, so now let's imagine, and this is my thought experiment, let's imagine these two branching selves. So we start out with the businesswoman, and then
Right.
businesswoman A in one world makes the right choice, or at least because of indeterminacy, the choice that is actualized is the one where she helps, and that
Right.
helps
I
to
would not use the phrase because of indeterminacy.
yeah, that doesn't really
Example
make
of-
sense, but
Right. There's indeterminacy involved, but you want it not to be the
okay,
cause.
so it's not
That's
it is
tricky.
not determined by herself that she will make that choice.
It's not determined antecedently by herself
Yes.
that that's the choice she must make,
Okay.
but it is determined by herself when she makes it.
All right. Now, so in world one, let's say she makes the good choice, she helps, and then she becomes a super amazing person, and she makes the best choice in every self-forming action. And let's say, you're wrong about heaven. There is a heaven and a hell. She ends up in heaven, whereas
Right.
in world B, she makes the wrong choice, and it's sort of
Right.
the worst. It's the extremes of the tree. So in one world, it makes the best choice every time, in the other, it makes the second choice. Now, the difference I want to say, here's me being, for the sake of argument, the difference between heavenly businesswoman and hellish businesswoman is luck. Now, and of course, you're definitely opposed to that, but I'm going to present it in the most serious objection that you can then respond to. It is. There is no difference between it's the same original self that results in both of these things. They both come from the same tree, and the only difference is, I want to say randomness or luck, but you don't like those terms.
That's what we have to. We have to avoid the conclusion that the difference is randomness, there or in any other place. Now, first of all, we've got to get clear here that these would be, if you have a lot of branching trees here, where she could go in future. If you have a lot of branching trees here, the two you gave are extreme at the outer limits.
Right.
There's a lot of things in here.
Right.
All my choices now are bad, and I go down to hell.
Right.
And no. There's a lot of things. She's got a future, and she has a chance to redeem herself. She may feel pangs of conscience when she goes on to the meeting and resolves to change later on, and then she does have other choices later on. So we have many of these going on, and we have development over time. So these would be the extreme cases. That's the first thing to say. But now we want to get to the basic thing here, which is that you're absolutely right. There's a thought here that it's a matter of luck. I mean, you can do it in a more elementary way, as Al Mealy and other critics do, by talking about the same person or their counterpart in another possible world in exactly the same situation. And one goes this way, one goes the other, and it's a matter of chance, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of ways to put it. You put it in a very nice way. So you've got to deal with this. This is where the whole plural voluntary control thing gets into the picture, because it looks like it's a matter of chance and therefore a matter of luck, which way the person will go here if it's undetermined. And this required a lot of work for me over the years. And I introduced at this point perhaps the most controversial feature of my view, which is that I imagine in self-forming action situations that a person is making efforts to make each of their conflicting values prevail over the other. Okay, so that the deliberative process has sub-processes within it.
The little angel and the little devil.
Whatever, so that she really wants to go on to her meeting, and she wants to resist the temptation to help, actually, because she so wants to go on to her meeting. And she has to make an effort to make those motives, those ambitious motives, prevail. Some people, when they talk about weakness of will, always put it in a one-sided way, that you have to make an effort to make the moral thing prevail over the other. But I say we can be making an effort to make our selfish instincts prevail over our moral ones many times in life, and let's not kid ourselves about that, right?
Yeah, you could be saying, stop being a sap. You're always sabotaging your chances at promotion.
Sabotaging your career here over morality, because you have images of your mother screaming at you or something, and that's silly, So what I imagine is that we are making plural efforts in self-forming choice situations. One effort caused by the motives for the moral side is being made, because efforts have to be made whenever there is resistance that has to be overcome. And in this case, there's two-way resistance in the will. Either way, well, then you got to have an effort to try to, if there's two resistances to both, you got to make an effort to have either one prevail, right? So I imagine plural efforts here. Now, some people say, well, we're not conscious of plural efforts, and I have a whole response to that. This is a theory about what may be going on underneath when we are torn in this way. It's not phenomenology. And as a matter of fact, my argument is that if we tried to figure out what free will really was on the surface, phenomenologically or consciously, it would always appear to be a mystery, as it always has in history. We have to have a theory about what's going on underneath. And that's what I argue here.
So that's Sellers again. You're coming back to Sellers.
It's interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of it that way, but indeed it is. We have to have a theory here that has some scientific viability. We can't prove it to be true, but the fact is, in other words, we have. I postulate parallel processing in the free decision-making brain. And we know there's parallel processing on the input side of the ledger in perception. Why not consider parallel processing on the outside, on the output side of the ledger, in deliberation, choice, and action? And I say that's what we have to imagine to make sense of libertarian free will. So anyway, when we look at a deliberative process, it would look like, hey, look, it would look like flipping a coin. Oh, well, I'm deliberating. I have thoughts for this side, thoughts for that side. We come to the end, and at the end, it's chance. It's some indeterminism that chooses one way or the other. That seems no better than flipping a coin, right? But my thought is, let's put that's because you imagine the whole past is like a big bubble, includes everything prior to the moment, as when you define determinism. And of course, it includes my whole psychological past. Historically, some libertarians have tried to keep your psychological past out of it. That's dualism, right? But no way. It's in there. The whole past, same psychological past. Two agents have exactly the same past. One of them does this, one of them does that. How could it be anything else but chance? Okay. Well, I say, put a microscope on that whole past, because that deliberative process preceding is very complex, and it involves a whole host of sub-processes. And among these sub-processes are these volitional streams, which I call efforts. You could also call them exercises of willpower. And you put the microscope on there and you see how we have these two different streams. So in the one world where you choose one thing, there's a different narrative to the story than in the other world, even though, I don't even think the pasts were the same, because I have reasons for saying that, but I have mistakenly said that in the past. I don't think the pasts are exactly the same. They don't have to be. But leave that aside for the moment. In one world, you have the following narrative, that the person was trying to make the moral choice by resisting the temptation to do the ambitious choice, and they succeeded. And then that is very much like many examples that come down from Austin and Anscombe, where they emphasize that if you do something, if you are trying to do something like sink a putt, right, and you do so, even though it was undetermined and you might have failed, you did it. You're responsible for it. It's your agency. It was done by you. Even though it was undetermined. Moreover, the indeterminism there, since it was internal to the effort, is not the cause, because on probability theory, the cause of a probabilistic event has to raise the probability that will occur, not lower it. And in this case, the indeterminism lowers the probability that it will occur. What raises the probability is your prior motives that are inclining you to do it, and the effort you're making to do it. Those things are the things, if without them, there'd be no chance you did it. And so the indeterminism, I say, is not the cause. It's involved causally, but it's not the cause. It's like the vaccination that didn't prevent the disease in probabilistic causation. So on the narrative on this side, you have this person struggling to overcome the selfish motives and succeeding. They're responsible. They did it. They did it voluntarily. They did it intentionally. They certainly did it on purpose. They were making an effort to do it. And it was rational because the motives that caused it and brought it about were the motives for doing the moral thing. The motives for doing the other thing didn't come into it.
This sounds kind of Manichaean to me. You know what I mean?
I know it is. Well, you know, that's an interesting point. You're raising a lot of points I hadn't thought about here before, but this is really true. Do you want to elaborate?
Well,
on
that
that?
you have the dark and the light are both acting within you, and when you do good, it's because the light won out, and when you do bad, it's because the dark won out.
Okay, all right, very good. Yeah, this is interesting.
Quantum Manichaeanism.
Yeah, quantum Manichaeanism. Interesting. Yeah, well, the thing about Manichaeanism, of course, they put the same thing into God and the universe. You know, there's the good and the evil part. But when you think about it in terms of human beings, we have our bad nature and we have our good nature. And we are divided in that way. The only disagreement I would have is that the bad nature is like something that isn't me, and it does it and not me. And the good nature is something that isn't me and it doesn't me. That part of the Manichaean thing, I'm not mine here, because I am saying that it is us if we are self-formed, but even if we are even if we are determined to have these two things, it is us because we are the ones that bring about one thing. It isn't sort of, oh, it was the devil in me. That's a cop-out, I think. Or, you know, it was the good in me or whatever. Yeah, there's something Manichaean here in the sense that to be a self-forming agent and to have free will, you have to be at times in your life, in fact, at many times, a very divided person. Okay? Now, one other thing you mentioned earlier that I want to speak to is that this is not all a matter of moral versus non-moral choices. I list in my significance of free will 5 or 6 different contexts. Yeah, I mean that's really the 1996. So that goes way back. It's 20 years now.
Wow.
It really covers everything, but it doesn't give the whole story because I've refined many things since. But it's still a very good book, if I may say so. Anyway, I distinguish about 5 or 6 things in there. Sometimes I go back and I see, my goodness, did I make those distinctions? I just 5 or 6. So first of all, you've got the moral versus the self-interest. Those are the ones we always think about and use as examples, actually. But also you've got prudential choices. Where you're thinking about the long-term goal. Should I eat this piece of pie now or have the extra drink trying to lose weight? That could be an SFA. Right? Then there are things for which you have aversions. Oh my God, my wife wants me to mow the lawn. God damn it.
In Texas in the summer? That
Yeah,
could be fatal.
Right. And sometimes just getting out of bed in the morning after a long, dreary night. So things you have aversions to, and overcoming those aversions. I think they all can be. So there's 3 different things that could be SFAs. I also imagine other SFAs that are strictly practical, actually, where people are making decisions. What field should I go into? What choices of career should I make? Who should I marry? Should we have children? These I take to be can be very much definitely self-forming actions, and they change what we will become, depending on what we choose. To have children, I mean, let's face it, makes you a different kind of person than you would be if you didn't.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So this is self-formation. So I add that into the mix too. Practical choices like that. I use some examples there about a woman graduating from law school deciding whether she wants to join a large firm in Chicago or a small firm in Austin. So she has choices here, and there may be good reasons for each, and she's torn. But also there are limitations on what she can choose. I mean, being a topless dancer in Seattle doesn't enter into it, So you're limited, but it will determine what law firm she goes into, what sort of person I think she becomes too. and who you marry, and God. So there's five. I think I made a sixth and seventh even in significance. I can't remember, but at least those five different ones. So the moral ones are only one way in which we form ourselves, and I think that's important to make that point.
Okay, well, we've been talking for so long. See if you can give a 5 to 10 minute summary of the high points of this, because I don't think we have time to do it justice, but I do want you to say a little bit about what you think the key ideas are here.
Right. Well, it's an attempt. It's called the extent to which we can accept the idea that there are plural values without getting into relativism, and while arguing that there may be some values that are objectively good and objectively right. And that's of course a standard kind of thing in ethics. There's nothing new about the problem, but I approach it in a different way. And now I have to really remind myself.
Well, there's the key notions that you want to touch on are the moral sphere and these 4 dimensions.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You see, so I introduce a version of Kant's principle of treating others as ends, and so
the
on.
ends principle, as you call it.
I call it the ends principle. That's right, and it defines a moral sphere. A moral sphere exists when everybody in it. It may be a small group, or it may be the whole world. A moral sphere exists when it's possible for everyone to treat everyone else in that group as an end rather than a means. In other words, and I have a more elaborate account of what it means to treat as an end. It's to afford them openness, respect, allowing them to pursue their purposes and their way of life without interference or subordination to you or whatever. That notion of openness, respect plays a key role, I think, also in political philosophy. So a moral sphere is one in which everyone in the sphere can treat everyone else with an end in this sense, with openness, respect. And it doesn't necessarily require that you have what Darwell makes a distinction between recognition respect and appraisal respect. It doesn't mean that you appraise the way they live or their plans of action or what they do and you think it's great or excellent or anything of the sort. Openness respect is a recognition respect, namely that they have the right to live it, unless of course, they live their life in such a way as to prevent anybody else in that sphere from doing theirs. And that's where the ethical part gets into this story, see. A moral sphere breaks down when somebody acts in such a way that they make it impossible for others to pursue their plans of action and their ways of life without interference and constraint. As well. And I go back to it's not exactly my businesswoman example, but it's similar. A person seeing an assault taking place in an alley. The moral reason for doing something about it is that the moral sphere has broken down in the sense in which I define it, right? This person can either walk on by, in which case there's going to be a person in that sphere where you could have an influence that's not going to be treated with openness, respect, namely the victim. If you, however, interfere, there's going to be someone who's not treated with openness, respect, maybe the perpetrator. And if the police or others come in and they stop, there's going to be some. So the moral sphere is broken down, and moral sphere breaks down when it's impossible to treat everyone with openness, respect, no matter what you do. And then the argument is, a lot of complication here, but the idea is when the moral sphere breaks down, the moral thing to do is to restore the moral sphere again in this case, by stopping the one who has broken it and made it impossible for everyone else to be so treated. And I think if you pursue that line, you get a whole moral theory. And you get a good sense of morality. There's a lot more complication that has to come into it here. But that would be the idea. And so that morality would break down. Now I have spheres of moral sphere breakdown. So you imagine a circle in the middle. This is the moral sphere. This is where everybody can treat everyone else with respect. Some people say, well, gee, in life, we're never in a moral sphere because we're always encountering
There are assholes everywhere.
Yeah, there are assholes everywhere. That's right. But it isn't just human conflict that counts. For example, if a repairman comes to my door and so on, in a certain sense, we are using each other as means. But we aren't breaking the moral sphere in my sense because he's pursuing his way of life and what he wants as long as he gets paid for doing his work. He's pursuing his life, and I'm pursuing mine, getting my toilet to work.
Oh, I can see I can just hear the Marxists pulling their hair out here.
Yeah, well, okay, there you go. Interesting point. So it isn't just conflict here, but it's conflict where you are not willing to compromise, but rather force your will on the other. I talk about a neighbor here who has to work all night and sleeps during the day, and the other neighbor plays in a band and he's practicing his trumpet. Right. And so, okay, it's all right if they find a way. I sleep here and you do it then, rather than the guy runs over here and smashes the trumpet, which he might do.
If it was bagpipes, then that would be justified.
Okay. So there are several stages of the moral sphere, and the way I put it, in the moral sphere here, everybody can treat everyone else in this way, with openness, respect. The first level of moral sphere breakdown is when there's conflict, so that it's quite impossible for everybody to get everything they want. This is like the neighbors here with the horn and the whatever. And the idea in that second sphere, this is the conflict of interest sphere, is the moral sphere is clearly broken down because both of them are having trouble pursuing their way of life as they would like. So when the moral sphere breaks down in a conflict situation, the idea to restore it is to find a compromise which allows each, to the degree possible, to go on pursuing their plans of action and ways of life without interference. And that's what they do if they find a compromise. If they can't compromise and one guy comes over and breaks the trumpet, then you move to a third sphere. And this is really where you have moral sphere breaking actions, treating persons as means, because somebody decides to resolve the conflict by imposing their will on the other side, much as the assailant did in the alley. And they then have broken the moral sphere, made it impossible for other people involved to treat them with respect, and everyone else too. Now, by the way, I relate this to Kant's famous murderer at the door. On this theory, it's insane to tell the truth to the murderer at the door just because he's a human being, because you have to look at what plan of action he is pursuing here. He's going to make it impossible for all of us to treat everyone, himself or the victim, as a means here. And that's why I sort of part company with Kant, assuming that's what he holds. There's some debate, of course. So my view is, for example, with regard to Kant, is my ends principle differs from the categorical imperative, the second form, by the fact that we don't owe everybody openness, respect, simply because they are rational beings capable of choosing their own ends. It depends on what ends they choose. They are not worthy of respect independently of the ends they choose. And if those ends make it impossible for others to pursue their own ends, then they are not worthy of respect to that degree anymore. So when you get to that stage, you restore the sphere by stopping the person who's broken it, and then you're back to the moral sphere again. But now, I imagine at the extreme, the fourth sphere, but it isn't a sphere, is where your attempt to find compromise doesn't work, so to speak, and war breaks out, right? That fourth sphere is basically a Hobbesian state of nature.
I was going to say that actually this whole notion that in some sense we have it's a coordination problem to create the world of morality. It sounds very Hobbesian, a very Hobbesian project.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. I'll have to think about that more. But of course, it's not really Hobbes in terms of his whole political theory and the rest of it and so on. But it's interesting to call it a coordination problem. It sort of is.
But that we are in some sense that the very possibility of morality is made is a function of coordinated activity by individuals.
Right. That's true. That's good, and I'll have to think more about that. When you get to that fourth stage, you have a Hobbesian state of nature, and it may be that if it's two countries or something, it may just be impossible, and it's going to be war, or it's going to be some kind of subordination. We see that in the world today.
Yes,
everywhere.
We don't want to look.
Right, but that's the structure of the moral theory, and the key thing is that you're not worthy of the respect which is being granted here, irrespective of how you act and whether you respect others. Now that means that worthiness for respect or being treated as an end or for moral treatment as a human being is going to depend on how you treat other human beings. All right, that follows here, and that's really sort of my argument. If you wish to be worthy of respect, deserving of respect, you've got to respect others in this way. And the degree to which you do not do that, you are not worthy of respect from them. And if you are not worthy of respect for them, you are not objectively worthy of respect. Because what objective worthiness for respect means is being worthy of respect from everybody, no matter whether they give it to you or not. And that's what objective worth is. I have a whole chapter on the notion of objective worth in there. And objective worth is worth from all points of view. And in order to have such worth, moral worth from all points of view, you've got to be respectful of all other points, to the degree that you can. Mm-hmm. You know what I say. And there's your morality here. There's your justification, so to speak. We get objective worth out of this. And my chapter on objective worth is interesting because I define several kinds of it, but it is fundamentally worth from all points of view.
Now, you call this ethics and the quest for wisdom.
Yeah, I was going to throw wisdom in there.
Which,
Go ahead.
I mean, do you see this as sort of a throwback to kind of ancient philosophical concerns? I mean, is this reinvigorating philosophy as it was practiced in the Athenian, square?
It is, but it is not exactly like the reversion of various virtue ethicist theories going back to Aristotle and the Greeks and so on. Although I have nothing against that, having virtues is going to be related. If you don't have certain virtues, you're not going to keep the moral sphere going here. And so I have nothing against virtue ethics, but I just don't think it's the whole story. It is a reversion here, and it's going back to when I give my chapter on wisdom. I say that I go back to Aristotle, and I define wisdom as knowing what's worth believing about the nature of things, and that's subjective reality, objective knowledge. And knowing what's worth striving for in the nature of things. That's what I call objective worth, or value, or whatever you want to call it here. These are the two objects of ancient wisdom as Aristotle defines it, Sophia, in the Metaphysics and his other works. And so I use Aristotle here as a key to the notion of wisdom. But I don't talk, I don't talk necessarily about what the many ethicists call practical wisdom in Aristotle's sense, phronesis. That's in there, as I say, because of virtue ethics and all that. I'm all right with that. But I'm interested in Sophia when I say wisdom in the title of that book. But wisdom is interested not just in objective understanding of the universe. That's metaphysics, basically. That was Aristotle's word for metaphysics, wisdom, Sophia. But also objective worth, what's worth striving for in the nature of things. Now, for Aristotle and for the ancients, that converged, because if you understood the structure of nature, since it was based on final causes, then you would know what was objectively worth striving for in the nature. We've cut that apart here, but I'm trying to put them back together. Let's get both stages of wisdom here, objective knowledge and objective worth. And of course, the ethics part is going to focus on objective worth. So I began to ask myself, well, what is it to have objective worth? The kind of worth that should be recognized by everybody, whether it is or not. For example, the truth on the epistemic side of this equation, objective knowledge, objective reality, the truth is defined as that which should be recognized as true by everybody, though clearly it isn't. That's the objective truth. That anyone who affirms it is right and anyone who doesn't is wrong, so that it is worthy of being objectively recognized by all. And I say objective worth is the good and the right way of living that's worthy of being recognized as good by all. It isn't necessarily, but it's worthy of it. It's worth, objective worth. And I say that, leave it to science to find out this one here, or philosophy, I suppose, too, because Aristotle meant that's what he meant by metaphysics. But I focus on this side. And I say, following the reasoning we just went through on the moral sphere and so on, that if you want to find out what's worth striving for in the nature of things and what will make your life, whatever you do, objectively worthy, that is worthy of being recognized as good from all points of view, which is, then you will have found it. You must act within the moral sphere.
Wow, well, it's certainly an amazing project, but, it seems pretty clear to me that A.J. Ayer didn't take that 12...
That's truly fascinating. Yes, indeed. I mean, logical positivism was a kind of a spur because it sort of said, these philosophical problems, they're all pseudo problems. And the other thing about pluralism and value in here is my wife has pointed this out to me. I grew up in a small New England town outside of Boston called Maynard. It's not very well known, but it's right next to Concord, Mass. And my uncle in past times was an immigrant from Italy, and my father was an immigrant from Newfoundland, but actually Ireland. But he was for several generations in Newfoundland. In New England, they called them Newfies. Right. And I once said that I was Newfie in this respect, and I only met one other philosopher who claimed that his ancestry was Newfie as well, and that was Quine.
Oh, really?
Willard said that, yeah. And he's the only other one. But in any case, my father was on that side. My father on the Italian side owned a farm that bordered down on White's Pond, which was the sister pond to Walden. So this is sort of this area. But the main thing about Maynard is it was cut out from all these towns, Acton, Concord, and whatever, that sent militia to the Concord Bridge to meet the British, in the poem and all. Because there were factories there, and the Yankees wanted to keep in the outer towns, which were more rural and nice, and all the immigrants kept piling into this town that was cut out of them in the middle. And that's the town I grew up in. There was a huge woolen mill that functioned until it moved south in the 50s. You know how that went. there were, at least 12 to 15 different languages spoken in that town. And there were every kind of church imaginable. There were a couple of different Catholic churches, the Polish one and the Irish, Italian one, and there was even some kind of, there was synagogue, every Protestant denomination, and there was even some kind of, I don't know whether it was Eastern Orthodox, it might have even been a mosque for all I knew, but there were 15 different languages spoken. It was pluralist, and it was very difficult because they always used to tell ethnic jokes about each other and talk about how, oh, I don't know, I can't get along with these Polacks, or, you know, these Dagos are dangerous and all this. But there was always this line that was spoken at a town meeting, because they had town meetings. It was New England, after all. This sort of Italian guy got up at a town meeting and said, well, I can't stand them and those and whatever and so on. He said, but this is America. We all have to learn to get along with one another. And that was the story. It was funny how they all struggled to try to make it work throughout all these different language things. My grandmother used to take me to a movie on Tuesday nights, and she couldn't understand, she was Italian, she couldn't understand English, so she would always leave 15 minutes earlier before the end of the movie. I was only 5, so it didn't matter, and took me down first to the Jewish grocer and then the Italian grocer, and by the time I got to be 6 or 7, she had to drag me out, of course. But it's amazing. I don't know how she communicated with the Jewish grocer. She was an Italian, he was in some kind of Yiddish or whatever, and so on. But that was the way it was. And my wife reminded me in later life, you know, that's where you got your thing on pluralism. And I think she's absolutely right. So there you go about youth and history. And at the same time, I'm reading H.A.
Right.
So what a confused young man, huh?
Well, it worked out well for you.
Yeah, well, anyway, it was great.
All right, well,
And
thanks, Bob. I really want to thank you because, as I said, this is the second time you did this because I've lost the recording didn't take the first time, and
well, I'm glad I enjoyed it just as much as the first, and indeed I straightened out a few more things, and I learned a number of things that I got to look into from your comments. So that's really terrific.
maybe we'll do it again in a couple of years, and
Yeah, hopefully that would be.
you'll have written another book by then.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
All right, thanks a lot, Bob.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. I love your project.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
Bye, Bob.